I just want to go to bed. Answering the title of this video, no. Simple answer here is no. iPadOS 14 is good for what it is. It works great, and well, it's just as limiting as iPadOS 15 is. The iPad, being a productivity, laptop replacing, day conquering machine, is a bond between hardware and its software. And the hardware is the same between iPads with iPadOS 14 and 15, right? Therefore, it's just as good as a productivity machine on either OS. But iPadOS 15 does bring some quality of life improvements, making life with the iPad Pro just that much better. Before we can get into the software side of things, we need to talk a little bit more about the hardware, more specifically, the bond between hardware and software. For the last few years, ever since the iPad Pro got its major redesign back in 2018, the hardware has always been and has always seemed to be ahead of the software. And that gap, instead of shrinking, has been growing and been getting wider each year, along with new system and new operating system. Yes, the hardware improves each year, but really not that much. With 2018 iPad Pro to the 2020, there wasn't that big of an upgrade. But with iPadOS 13 and the release of the Magic Keyboard and the iPad Pro, it took the iPad's hardware so far ahead of where it was before the Magic Keyboard was announced. And when these new M1 iPads were announced with 8 or 16 gigs of RAM, we all thought iPadOS 15, coming soon, after was going to blow our minds. And during the 2 weeks that we had the M1s while waiting for iPadOS 15 to be announced, we got to play with the M1 Pro using iPadOS 14. And if you're not on the betas, you still are using these crazy powered devices with a fairly boring iPad software. So you see what I mean when I say the bond between hardware and software just isn't great right now. It's almost like a one-sided relationship. Hardware is doing all the work in the relationship, and software isn't even trying. But they can't break up because hardware without software is just a shell, and software without hardware is just a thought. So we need Apple to match the software to the hardware. Which now leads me to iPadOS 14. It definitely has its flaws. When it was announced along with iOS 14 back in 2020, WWDC, it seemed like a kind of a letdown in the realm of its similarity to iOS 14 and all the features I loved from iOS 14, but just not as good. Like, the main features from iOS 14 didn't go to iPadOS 14. Like the app drawer. Got it on iOS 14, just not a thing on iPadOS 14. Widgets that were being able to move anywhere were just limited to the Today view on the iPad, not everywhere. If you haven't picked up my drift yet, is that how you say that? If you don't catch my drift yet? Anyways, iPadOS 15 is what iPadOS 14 should have been. It should have had the app library like the iPhone did, but it's a year late. It should have had movable widgets like the iPhone did, but again, a year late. Aside from that, iPadOS 14 got most everything else that iOS 14 did, but I think those were the biggest features of WW 2020. There are still some quality of life improvements this year with iPadOS 15. Like the somewhat better multi-window management. Well, like you can manage 2 windows easier and then have slide overview, but in my use cases, while that's useful to have, in my time of using the iPad Pro as my main computing, day conquering, laptop replacing device, I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I have used multitasking and slide over. Like, I just use the one screen for anything I do for the most part. And then I use my 12 Pro Max as my secondary display, right? Like, Apple's ecosystem, it just gets you, right? The missing ingredients. iPadOS is great for what it is, but it's definitely lacking. And yes, it's definitely different than any OS on actual computers, such as on macOS, with actual computers. With iPadOS, it makes you use a trackpad more of a way like it's a substitute for your finger on the touchscreen, rather than a cursor and navigator as it is on a computer. And as for me, iPadOS hasn't limited me much at all, but I'll admit that it isn't perfect. It's missing a few key ingredients that are rather important, such as multi-window use, with more than just 2 windows in split screen. Even if I wouldn't use it, I know others would. And please God, better useful external monitor support. I can't English right now. So you can dock the iPad and use it with a bigger display like you can on the MacBook. Like, please, why hasn't that been a thing? Like, shift screen is great, but why can't that? iPadOS 15 is a nice quality of life improvement from iPadOS 14. And it's just one more step closer to the software side of things, matching and making use of the incredible hardware that we have on the iPad. iPadOS 15 is definitely a letdown compared to what everyone was expecting with WWDC, especially with the significant RAM boost Apple gave their newest iPad. It's not what we expected, and that's because Apple doesn't want the iPad to replace the MacBook like everybody was thinking. I really think that Apple is trying to create a second option for people who need computing power on a portable device. Instead of using the MacBook, they're wanting to give this second option, as well as redefining the two-in-one market with the Magic Keyboard and the slimness and beauty of the iPad Pro by itself without the keyboard and with the pencil attached to a side. Even though iPadOS has seemed like an afterthought the last couple of years, especially compared to the totally thought out and intentional hardware in the iPad Pro, I really believe that Apple knows what they are doing, and they will give us what they know that we want that we didn't even know that we wanted, if that makes sense. When it comes to iPadOS, I see massive potential for the iPad, specifically the Pro. Who knows? Maybe they'll even come out with a specific iPad Pro OS. But that's for another video. Wink. Thanks for watching. I'm Jake. This is Shot on my phone.